Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 588 through 591, which will cover manga chapters 663 through 665. Well, that's hard to say. And I'm going up to 591 because episode 590 is actually a filler crossover special with Toriko again, but also Dragon Ball Z of all things, which I'll briefly touch upon near the end of this episode. So if you're interested in that, that'll be towards the end. It won't be the last thing I talked about, but it'll be there. But let's move on to the synopsis. So the synopsis, the Straw Hats are finally reunited again, but left with a bunch of questions as to what is happening on the island and what to do next, as they have to find a way to help the kids, while Smoker reveals the true horrendous mastermind behind what is going on in Punk Hazard. Alright, so differences. There are a handful of differences, but I'd say the biggest ones are mostly just like extensions of scenes, which I'll kind of talk about as the last point. But the first major difference I'd say is the scene of Tashigi trying to run in to help Smoker, but is kind of held back by her subordinates, is added in the anime. As in the manga, the next time we actually see her, she's already running towards Smoker after Luffy has made contact with Law. And so there's that little scene that's kind of added to extend this out. The next is during the scene where Kinemon gives everyone clothes. The anime leaves out the opening portion of that scene where we see the kids running in the snow and one of them trips and falls, which is kind of what necessitates them to have to stop, which is where the scene in the anime actually starts. So this happens basically off screen, it seems like, in the anime, whereas in the manga you actually get to see this. I don't know why they cut this, to be honest, because it seems like they were trying to add scenes in to fill time, so I don't know why they felt the need to take this out of the anime. Next is the dialogue for Frankie and Nami a little altered here too. Frankie never suggests ripping off Chopper's fur with Chopper yelling back. And while Sanji does in fact pervertedly scream for a mirror and a camera, Nami's dialogue is different, as in the anime she says, "I'm going to string you up if you keep this up," while in the manga she yells, "What are you planning to take a picture of? Also, stop nosebleeding on my body." So it seems like they maybe changed that to make it a little less pervy, but I don't know how you even manage that. There's also a really funny scene added later at the very end of this trio of episodes where Zoro, Sanji, and Brook are running in the snow to try and catch up to Kinemon. This was added, and the gag of Sanji accidentally slipping and Zoro inadvertently chivalrously catching him in Nami's body is also added for the anime, and I love that joke, so I'm glad that they added that one in. And like I said, there's a couple other scenes that were extended slightly with a bit more scenes or details, but nothing fundamentally was changed. So for example, Brownbeard's explanation showed a bit more of Punk Hazard before it became a wasteland. The scene with the kids writhing in pain from their withdrawals was also added, a couple scenes to kind of extend that as well. And then also the Yeti Cool Brothers intro was extended a little bit more in the anime as well, including that scene we just talked about. But that's it for these episodes in terms of differences, so let's get into the rest of the episodes because this is going to be a long one. After last episode's shocking defeat of Smoker at the hands of Law, we get another somewhat faded reunion of Law and Luffy, who is excited to meet Law again to thank him for saving his life 2 years ago. And this interaction with Law makes you think that maybe Law won't be a villain to Luffy in this arc, as there doesn't seem to be any hint of aggression towards Luffy from Law. It's honestly a really sweet scene with Luffy unable to pronounce Trafalgar and starts to just call him Torao, continuing his habit of giving people nicknames. And I don't know why he just didn't start referring to him by his first name, Law, which is infinitely easier to say. But, I mean, it's Luffy. And Luffy calls him Torao, which is just the first two syllables of Trafalgar, because in Japanese, it's pronounced Torafarugaro. And so, it is sort of the kanji for a man or male. So now, depending on what translation you see this in, it may be translated differently. Sometimes you'll see it as Tra guy, or sometimes you may see it as Trafi. Honestly, this one doesn't really matter which one you use. It can be either, really, and it still gets the point across. But I love that Luffy basically just calls him by the first two syllables of his last name, and then man. So it's just Tora man. The funny thing too is, obviously if you know Zoro's Toragani move, like Tora is also tiger, so it does sound like he's just calling him Tiger Man as well. And while it's a happy reunion for Luffy with Law, and he's also somewhat happy to see Smoker too, Tashigi, on the other hand, is filled with rage at the sight of her superior officer Smoker having been defeated by Law. In a fit of rage, she again recklessly charges in to attack Law, to which he immediately shuts down by doing his shambles technique and swaps Tashigi and Smoker's personalities, which will be fun to see when they both wake up eventually. Luffy and Law both agree to meet up later to ask each other questions, but for now tells him where he can find his other nakama around back, which by this point, given his overall attitude, led me to pretty much believe that Law may not actually be an antagonist to Luffy, at least for this arc. And you just don't get any sense of malice with the way Law is portrayed here. And there's the fact that he saved Luffy's life back at Marineford, so you gotta think that he did that for a reason, which we hope will become clearer in this arc now that they've been reunited. Back with Nami's group and the kids, they are now stuck in the freezing cold with nowhere to go, and they're in some serious trouble when the samurai head reveals something very unexpected. He is, in fact, a devil fruit user. Although he doesn't explicitly call it a devil fruit, he merely says he ate a strange fruit and calls it magic. But it's obvious from this description that it is a devil fruit. It allows him to basically take an inanimate item that's placed on a person's head to make whatever clothes appear on that person. Now, the fruit is not named here, and I believe it's never outright stated in the story what this fruit is called, so I'll tell you here since it's not really a spoiler, and I actually was able to kind of predict the name of this fruit at the time myself. And it is revealed in an SBS later on. It's called the Fukufuku no Mi, and there have been a couple different translations of this. I've seen and heard of the cloth fruit, the clothes fruit, or the garb fruit. I think all of them are fine translations. The little translation of fuku is clothes, so I'm gonna go with clothes fruit. In either language, this is really hard to say, both in Japanese and English, because of the repeating alliteration. The crazy thing is this fruit, I'm trying to rack my brain, but I feel like this would have almost no application offensively, and is strictly for like disguise and defense, as you can probably conjure up like armor as well as stuff to kind of keep you hidden. So yeah, I think this is strictly a more defensive fruit than anything. Another note about this fruit is what it's referencing. So initially the samurai asks for leaves to be placed on the person's head in order to make the clothes. And this, I believe, is in reference to the fact that in Japanese folklore, tanukis, and which is the thing that Chopper's often getting mistaken for, transforms or shapeshifts by putting a leaf on its head. And this is also where the reference of Mario famously transforming into his Tanuki tail suit or his just full-on Tanuki suit power-ups after collecting a leaf that comes from a question mark box like in Super Mario Bros. 3, and also in every other subsequent game that suit appears in. It's here that Luffy's group finally regroups with everyone else, and my favorite moment from this reunion is Zoro immediately noticing Sanji with Chopper in his body, all excited and saying, "What is going on with that idiot Cook's high excitement or tension level?" As well as Luffy, Usopp, and Brook confused and freaked out that Nami is in Frankie's body, beating the crap out of her own body due to Sanji just constantly looking at Nami's boobs. This whole reunion scene is just chock full of craziness from everyone trying to get their bearings as to what is happening, to the samurai getting his legs back and prancing around with a head attached to its waist, while Luffy is on the ground sobbing at the loss of his Ashimaru, and Nami being upset that she beat up her own body with Frankie's strength. I mean, this is just craziness. And one moment that always caught my eye was how Nami gave Sanji back his cigarettes and cited that he's probably been enduring not smoking. But this begs the question, is Sanji's fixation with smoking more of a psychological crutch or more of a physiological addiction to like nicotine? From this, it would seem that Sanji is just psychologically more at ease when he smokes, which is interesting because Chopper seems to have no physical urges to smoke while in Sanji's body. So it seems like it isn't necessary to Sanji, and he's not necessarily addicted to smoking, like physiologically, it's more psychological than anything. Of course, I may also be reading too far into something Oda never really gave much thought to, even for himself. Sticking with this group though, in a later scene when we come back to this, we get to see the little forehead icons that Usopp makes for everyone to be able to tell who's actually who in each other's bodies. It's pretty funny and cute. It's in this same scene that I find it interesting that we get the information that the Straw Hats themselves don't know the concept of the worst generation, especially since two of them are part of it themselves. I was surprised to hear from Brownbeard that Blackbeard was considered part of the worst generation when I first read this, considering he's somewhat older than many of the others, and this is a point that is often confused by many people. The distinction between the worst generation as a group and the supernovas as a group. While they're very similar, they do have a distinction. So the worst generation is referred to as the 12 pirate captains that all emerged in infamy relatively around the same time just before the Summit War, while the supernovas is in reference to the 11 rookie pirates that all emerge with 100 million berry bounties or more by the end of the Paradise half of the Grand Line, which include everyone but Blackbeard from the worst generation, because he at the time didn't have a bounty and only becoming a threat until after he betrayed the Marines during the war at Marineford. It's also here we learn that Basil Hawkins was the one that did Brownbeard's crew in and took his legs. We also get confirmation that those folks in the ice were in fact prisoners that were brought to be experimented on. And this Dr. Vegapunk guy is starting to look like a pretty messed up guy who keeps destroying his labs and everything around them while conducting human experimentations. Up till now, I always had a pretty neutral view of Vegapunk, but then again, this explanation is from a secondhand account, and the fact this Brownbeard keeps talking about this master in a good light kind of caught my eye, because this seems oddly suspicious considering it's pretty evident that this master is not a good guy. So at this point, I wasn't sure what to believe about this Dr. Vegapunk, because I could legitimately see him being anything really, a good guy, a bad guy, a neutral guy. But of course, we learn later in the same episode that everything about the master has been a bold-faced lie to manipulate all the people to his bidding, and that he was the one that was the cause of everything, and that he is in fact an evil and sadistic mad scientist. But this reversal also kind of messes with your view on Law as well. It's like, maybe my initial judgment of Law is wrong. So this whole section is actually very good at kind of keeping you on your toes and confused about who's actually the bad guy and who's not. But what's sad is that by the end of episode 589, it's revealed that not only did the Master cause the accident that left all the prisoners without the use of their legs, he then returns to essentially act as their savior, when it was he himself who was the source of all their pain and suffering to begin with, which is pretty scummy. And because Brownbeard here also paints the other potential antagonists in this arc in a flattering light, here he calls Law another savior as well. He explains how he used his ability to merge animal body parts to replace people's damaged or inoperable body parts, resulting in all the centaur people. But I always had this question in my mind when I originally read this was, what happened to the animals that Law took the parts from? Are there a bunch of animals roaming around this island without legs, kind of like how Kinamon's torso is currently walking around? Oh, and one other thing I haven't mentioned yet is that we learned that the samurai's name is Firefox Kinamon from the Master, which is a pretty cool epithet. Firefox sounds awesome. Another funny scene that I wanted to kind of point out here is when Brownbeard mentions that the dragon is another creation of Vegapunk, and warns them to run if they ever come in contact with it, while Zoro verbally says, understood, but in his head he remarks, we already ate it, which I think is pretty funny. Now moving to the other part of the island, the G5 Marines were able to also escape with Smoker and Tashigi's bodies, and we get to see their swapped bodies, and the difference between the two is hilarious. Seeing the timid Tashigi and Smoker's usually gruff exterior looking all shy and proper, while on the other side of the cave, Smoker in Tashigi's body is absolutely hilarious, as he can't stand ever being fully clothed, and not only has he basically unbuttoned Tashigi's shirt, he's also taken her bra off too, and is just going bare-chested, to which Tashigi yells, "Please cover yourself up!" One thing is clear though with all these body swaps, Oda's character design doesn't just stop at the character models themselves, but in the way he presents them. Like if I saw the Smoker inside Tashigi and the Tashigi inside Smoker, I can almost immediately tell who they actually are. It's a clear testament to how good Oda is at creating unique and memorable characters in all aspects between both their designs, their characterizations, and personalities. I also like that the subtle gag where Tashigi in Smoker's body instinctively tries to adjust her glasses, but they're not there, so she gets a little embarrassed by that. And this is actually a real thing. As a lifelong glasses wearer myself, sometimes when I find myself without my glasses, like if I'm swimming or put in some situation where I'm without my glasses for an extended period of time, I will instinctively try to fix my glasses even though they aren't there and don't need to be adjusted. It almost becomes like a psychological crutch or like a nervous tic or something that you just instinctively do for whatever reason, because you do it so often for so long. It's in this same scene where we get a bit more information about what is going on, and this is where I was talking about in the earlier episodes about how Punk Hazard had these sort of awkward and long-winded exposition dumps that kind of kill the pacing, and this scene is one of them, as Smoker and Tashigi basically spell out what is probably happening here on Punk Hazard. He goes on to talk about that there's a mad scientist on this island who has been abducting children, and that someone on the island is silencing or falsifying all the reports to the newspapers and the Marines themselves. This scene serves to further build Smoker's suspicions and distrust of the Marines and the world government as institutions, as he tells his subordinates that the G5 soldiers who kind of have this blind faith in Marine pride is not a good thing, and that no organization should be put up on a pedestal, and as long as it's made up of people, it's never going to be perfect. And his line about if you assume too much, you'll miss the enemy is a very telling line, and I believe is one of the sort of central kind of sub-themes of this arc. The idea that if you assume too much about someone based on their affiliations, their position, their standing, or their appearances, you could miss something very important. This is, of course, portrayed very literally with all the body swapping, as you literally can't assume anything about people based on their appearances right now. And since they're all swapped, but this is also very much woven into this arc in many different ways, some of which I can't really talk about yet due to spoilers, but one character you really start to question whether their motives are good or bad is Law. Between what we know of him and what Brownbeard and Luffy mention, it constantly keeps you guessing whether he actually is an enemy or not, like I've mentioned in the beginning of this episode. Of course, there's one obvious giveaway, and that is Luffy's opinion on Law. This is why Smoker intrigues me so much, because he's one of the few people in the Marines who openly questions this about the Marines and the world government. What's interesting is that while he frames his lesson from the perspective of an ally in the Marines secretly being a potential enemy because of all the subterfuge that's happening, you could easily frame this the other way around, which is that if you assume too much about your perceived enemies, you might miss that they are secretly your ally. And I think you know where I'm going with this, and the fact that somewhere in Smoker's head, he has probably been thinking about this in regards to Luffy and the Straw Hats, which is why he's so fixated on him. And I think he also realizes that this might be another potential scenario where he and the Straw Hats will need to team up to save the kids. The other thing we learn from Smoker is that we finally get the identity and name of the Gas Master, and he is the rogue former world government scientist Caesar Clown, and he is played by a legendary anime voice actor, and one that is actually not new to One Piece. This is Yusei Nakao, who has previously played Eric, the villain from the Millennial Dragon filler arc that took place just after the East Blue Saga, and he was also Dr. Indigo, the clown-looking scientist from the One Piece movie Strong World. But his most well-known role has easily got to be Frieza from the Dragon Ball series. Some of you also might recognize him as a 12th Division Captain Kurotsuchi Mayuri from Bleach as well, who is yet another eccentric scientist of sorts from that series as well. Also, another more recent role that he's played that I kind of want to talk about is the villain Vaccine Man from One Punch Man. And if I may take a really quick unrelated tangent about this role, this was kind of an inside joke when it comes to Nakao's career. So in Japan, Nakao is also very famous for playing the villain Biking Man or Bacteria Man in the long-running kids anime Anpan Man. So the character of Vaccine Man is literally a buffed-up parody of Biking Man, and they're both played by Ryusei Nakao, which I think is hilarious. To add to that even further is that the hero, Anpan Man, is literally a bald hero with the primary colors of red and yellow that takes out the respective villains in one punch. Anpan Man is also very famous for defeating Biking Man with his iconic Punch in most episodes. And so that crossover is just really funny in terms of like the references. Anyways, thanks for listening to that random tangent. Like, I grew up watching Anpanman as a little kid, and now my niece and nephew are also enjoying it now. So it is a very fresh on my mind when I hear Nakao's voice. Speaking of voice actors, I also have to mention that Monet's voice actor, Naoko Matsui, while not quite as well known, plays a pretty major role in one of my favorite series that I've mentioned several times on this podcast, which is Detective Conan. And on that series, she plays Sonoko Suzuki, Ran's rich best friend. So it's fun to hear her voice, playing a villain in this arc. Monet seems to also be a scientist herself and is actually shown to be very cautious in not underestimating the Straw Hats like most do, as she tallies up their total bounties, but recognizes that their bounties haven't been updated in 2 years, which would indicate that they're all probably far stronger than their bounties would actually indicate, which she is correct. Aside from Luffy, the rest of the crew's bounties haven't been adjusted since the end of NES Lobby when you really think about it. The other thing about Monet is that when you look at her, she's got her arms have been replaced by the wings of a bird, essentially. But she somehow is able to write with a pen, holding, with the tip of her wings. I always find that really crazy, like talented, I guess you could say. Getting back to Caesar, he's revealed to be a former government scientist, but because of his war crime level experiments, particularly on the human experimentation side, along with chemical and biological warfare, he was eventually arrested but managed to get away and had a 300 million berry bounty placed on his head, which means that he has a far lower bounty than Luffy. And this is an interesting wrinkle, as we now have a second arc where the villain is clearly weaker than Luffy, if bounties are something to go by, which I think in this scenario, you can kind of put a little bit of stock into it. Again, while I do think it's underwhelming to have Luffy go up against a villain weaker than him, it does make the pacing, escalation, and the power scaling make more sense in the long run, which is something Oda has been really good about throughout this entire series, like I've mentioned several times in the past. The forethought he puts into making sure that the progression seems right, which is precisely what he did when he started the series. Pretty much every villain he faced until he ran into Crocodile from the beginning of the series was effectively weaker than Luffy, and we are seeing something very similar, mirroring almost exactly what happened, especially when you take into context the events that take place after this arc as well. Now going from the ominous yet exposition-filled ending of episode 589 to the beginning of episode 591, we get back into the fun adventure, and I have to point out that Luffy yet again slept through the entirety of the backstory time, and thus has no idea what the hell is happening. Sanji, realizing that Kinemon is gone to find his torso, feels a sense of responsibility for him and goes out after him, which is very Sanji-like. And Brook also offers to help, since he was the one who knows the location of where he saw the torso last. But with the two pervious members about to head out alone, and sensing the trouble that would cause Nami's body, and as annoying as their perviness gets, I did chuckle when Brook finally asked to see Nami's panties here, and Sanji's like, yeah, to which Nami immediately sends Zoro along with them, knowing that with Zoro around, Sanji would be too distracted by their rivalry to act upon any perverted thoughts. And I do love how by this point in the story, Oda and the audience really knows his characters so well that all of these interactions and reactions are pretty obvious, and it really makes sense, and they feel like actual lived characters. Speaking of funny, this is where we get one of my all-time favorite moments of the whole body swapping gag, and that is Robin's reaction to Frankie being inside Chopper's body. We know that Robin loves all things cute and cuddly, and naturally loves Chopper's cute and adorableness, but with Frankie's gruff and unrefined ways of speaking and acting inside Chopper, and more significantly, the creepy faces he makes, has Robin internally disgusted and furious with him. Especially when Nami mentions how their priority right now should be to return them all to their normal bodies, and that she doesn't want to be stuck in a pervert's body, to which Frankie takes that as a compliment, and the face he makes when he says, "Oi, oi, oi, home koroshi kayo," or hey, you're overpraising me, is so freaking amazing, with how he has Chopper's gums showing and how he contorts Chopper's face is proving too much for Robin to take, as she sternly warns Frankie to never make that face with Chopper's body, and then to also never speak another word while in that body. It's so funny seeing Robin's darker nature used for comedic bits, and easily one of my favorite moments of the entire series. But it's here we again go from lighthearted happy moment to pretty horrific one, as the kids start to experience some incredible pain from what looks like heavy withdrawal symptoms, with Sin reaching out and looking for something that looks like a piece of candy. Pretty soon all of the kids have similar symptoms of intense pain, and the moment where Chopper reveals his theory of what's happening is nothing short of chilling, as he mentions that he's found traces of a drug called NHC-10, which while does have medical applications in the world of One Piece, according to Chopper, he's learned from Dr. Kureha that it should be used only very sparingly, as it is highly addictive, and it seems to keep the kids essentially chained to the lab Caesar has been feeding these kids this drug via the candy laced with NHC-10 to get them hooked and stuck there. But without the drug, the withdrawal symptoms become so overwhelming that it causes the kids to turn extremely violent. And this is pretty chilling to watch as they display an insane amount of strength. And you can kind of start to see what Caesar is experimenting with. He's basically trying to artificially make giants with the same amount of strength. And this instantly vaults Caesar up to the top of the list as one of the most despicable and evil villains of all the past villains. Like, it's one thing to attack other pirates, even pillage villages of innocent people, but to kidnap innocent kids and perform unspeakable experiments on them is just horrible on a whole different level. And this kind of also lends to sort of the darkening of One Piece a little bit too. Like, obviously it's never going to go super dark, but it does start to get a little bit more serious and a little bit more heavy material in terms of like the subject matter that's covered post time skip. Like, you would never see a storyline like this in pre-time skip. I think the closest thing it gets to is the human trafficking of Hancock and also sort of the human auction shop. One side note I want to mention about this scene, and its slight difference with the manga that I found interesting, is while the scene is adapted incredibly faithfully, there's one word that was changed or perhaps censored for the anime. So when Chopper is explaining about the NHC-10 drug, he calls it a drug. Like, literally in Japanese, he just says the English word drug with a Japanese accent, as in doragu. But in the manga, Oda has Chopper saying that NHC-10 is a kakusei or stimulant, in other words, an upper, like a methamphetamine. And this got me very curious why the change. So I did a little digging and I learned that Japan has a very long history with drugs. And Japan is often seen as a country with a much smaller drug problem than many developed countries. And while statistically that may be true, it's not all like clean and rosy as you might think. Like, meth apparently is one of the most abused drugs in Japan. And their society is not exactly the most tolerant of drug use given their sort of collectivistic and outward appearance heavy nature of their culture. Historically speaking, their support systems for dealing with addiction is very limited, with many addicts being kind of just sedated and thrown into mental institutions and never really given any actual treatment to treat the addiction. And Japan's government also has an incredibly zero tolerance attitude when it comes to narcotics and drug offenses, as just on your second offense, even for like a small amount of like cannabis, can even result in a hefty jail sentence. And I believe for this reason, because of just how taboo anything related to drug use and particularly methamphetamines is, this was changed and censored to be a more, I guess, foreign word like the English word for drug. Of course, this is all just sort of my conjecture based on some limited amount of research. So it could also be a completely different thing, but this seems like why the reason for the change. To end this set of episodes, we get left on a crazy cliffhanger where we see the trio of Zoro, Brook, and Sanji, albeit in Nami's weaker body, all defeated by these massive giants called the Yeti Cool Brothers, which I will admit is a very cool name, but it is quite a shocking turn of events to see these three just completely knocked out off screen with seemingly little struggle. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this goes from here and what happened here. Now, before we end this podcast episode, there are a couple things I need to talk about in addition, and the first being episode 590. So, episode 590, like in the past, is the second half of a crossover special with the Toriko anime, where the first half is episode 99 of the Toriko anime, and this being the third crossover with Toriko, but this time there is a fun addition with none other than the legendary anime series Dragon Ball Z. Although this doesn't really save the episode and make it all that compelling to watch, other than the novelty of seeing two legendary series cross over like this, except when you see this, you kind of wish that instead of Toriko, you could have one more of the legendary big three, either Naruto or Bleach. Like, it would have been much cooler to see Naruto or Ichigo standing side by side with Luffy and Goku, just because they have sort of the bigger sort of relevance, I would say, at the time. Like, no offense to Toriko fans, but Toriko just does not stand up to sort of the big three and Dragon Ball Z. However, this was pretty cool if you're a Dragon Ball fan, since this episode aired 2 years after Dragon Ball Kai ended its run and 2 years before Dragon Ball Super would start. So between this and the new movie that was released at this time, the Dragon Ball Z Battle of the Gods, which premiered about a couple weeks before this episode, you got this kind of revitalization of the Dragon Ball franchise, and no doubt this crossover was done to promote more interest in the movie at the time. The other fun thing about this episode is, like I've mentioned many times in the past, many One Piece and Dragon Ball characters share the same voice actors, and it's fun to see them talk to each other, especially Krillin and Luffy, who are famously voiced by Mayumi Tanaka. But then you have Goku, Gohan, Goten, who are all voiced by Masako Nozawa, who also voices Kureha in One Piece. Toshio Furukawa, who also voices Piccolo in Dragon Ball, also does Ace. And speaking of Ace, his mom, Rouge, is voiced by Yuko Minaguchi, who also voices Videl and Pan in Dragon Ball as well. Similarly, Kozo Shioya, who voices Boo in Dragon Ball, voices Genzo and Pup Pug in One Piece. Takeshi Kusao, who voices both Future and Kid Trunks, is the voice of Koza. And the voice of Mr. Satan, or Mr. Satan, in this iteration should be no stranger to anyone who's watched any amount of anime, really. So Unsho Ishizuka, who took over the role of Mr. Satan during this era of Dragon Ball since Daisuke Gori passed away, who, if you remember, Daisuke Gori voiced Dory and was the original voice of Jinbei, who had to be replaced as well because of his untimely passing. So there's this incredible connection between them, but Ishizuka, who voices Satan, is the voice of Kizaru in One Piece, but he is also famous for being Jet in Cowboy Bebop, Zabuza in Naruto, the Japanese voice for Professor Oak in Pokemon, Police Inspector Nakamori in Detective Conan, as well as Kaiba in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and so many others. But sadly, he would also pass away too in 2018. And in any case, as a longtime fan of both series, this is always fun to see the two worlds cross like this because of so many similarities in terms of the voice acting. The episode itself is nothing all that special. It follows a similar food-based wildlife adventure set more in the Toriko world. But I did get a kick out of seeing random interactions, like when Gotenks is amazed by the General Frankie, but then is promptly disposed of because Frankie has to leave the mech suit to attack each time. And I feel like everyone in the Dragon Ball world should easily outclass the other two franchises in terms of power. Of course, Toei's writers recognized this and had Luffy and Toriko kind of basically be support for Goku to charge up his Genkidama or Spirit Bomb. And like I said, the novelty of seeing Luffy fighting alongside Goku is pretty fun, which is something we don't really ever get to see outside of the video game crossovers. But that's probably where the good things stop with this episode. It's pretty boring, to be honest. Also, finding this episode might be a little difficult, as it was never re-released on home video and is not really available on Crunchyroll or Funimation due to licensing issues. As for a long time before Crunchyroll and Funimation merged, One Piece's licensing rights were held by Crunchyroll and Dragon Ball's licensing rights were held by Funimation. And even now, with the merger of the two companies, you still can't find it on either of their sites. However, with the recent release of Punk Hazard on Netflix, you can for some reason see this episode again here in the US, but only on Netflix. Alrighty, so lastly, in this already pretty long episode, we have a new opening as of episode 591 titled Hands Up, performed by Kota Shinzato. And this serves as the 16th opening in the series and is one of my personal underrated favorites. Yet again, because it's one of my favorites, it gets a much shorter runtime at a total of 38 episodes from episodes 591 through 628, which is unfortunate and a crime. I just love this opening because of how it makes me feel. The lyrics, the melody, and the tone of this song are so optimistic and happy. I mean, they all mostly are, but this one is definitely one that I feel really captures that joy and inspiration of going on an adventure. But I think the one other ingredient that this song particularly has over most of the other ones in the past is that this has a sense of perseverance, enduring and recovering from failure or loss. Something about this song that I found very inspirational and love listening to this song when I need a pick-me-up. The lyrics themselves are pretty standard about going on an adventure, meeting any challenges that come along the way, the optimism by throwing your hands up and following your dreams. Pretty much your standard message for any One Piece theme song, but there are a couple moments where I feel the lyrics and the animation go really well together. And if you listen to the opening rankings episode that I made years back, I talk about this too, so this might be a little bit of a repeat from that. But the first one is during the slower interlude section where it goes, I keep the pain I don't want to forget in my heart. On that day, I softly carved it into it. A freedom that I won't lose to anyone. I grasp it tight in my hands and go. This meshes so well to the image of the colored silhouettes of each Straw Hat as they appear one by one beside Luffy's silhouette, which all perfectly come together in reference to Luffy's loss at the hands of Kizaru and losing his crew on Sabaody. How he won't forget the pain of that and obtaining the freedom necessary now to not lose anyone again, capped off with Luffy's outstretching Gomu arms around all 8 of them and giving this huge bear hug. And it's so awesome, like how well that lyric matches with what's actually shown on screen. The other moment I really love is actually right after this, during the lyrics, "Look up more, keep your head held high." And you see Luffy running to the bow of the Sunny, and the camera does a close-up shot of Luffy's chest. And so in Japanese, this moment is a little lost in translation because in English, it's translated as "look up more, keep your head held high," which is absolutely correct, and yet the camera is oddly focused on Luffy's chest. And that's because in Japanese, the phrase "hold your head up" is said as "mune wo hatte," which literally translates as "hold your chest out" or "puff your chest out." And that's why the camera focuses on Luffy's chest, as he's like puffing it out. It's also just a really satisfying moment and image seeing Luffy back with his crew and is able to hold his chest or hold his head up high again, surrounded by his crew, with that really soft smile there. Like internally, he finds so much peace and warmth being there with his nakama again. The beginning of this opening is also really cool and unique in that it's a stylized sequence of basically a color spread being drawn and colored in real time, ending with it coming to life. And it reminds me of a very polished version of the time lapses the official One Piece social media accounts often post of Oda drafting and drawing color spreads or the covers to the Tankoban manga releases. And it's really cool. Like if you've never seen any one of those, go to either the official Twitter or Instagram accounts of the official One Piece account, and they will often post Oda drawing the different color spreads, and it's really fun seeing, like, because you see everything really. You see him like coming up with concepts and ideas, and you'll see him sketch it. And then sometimes he'll just like completely like be like, nope, screw that, and just wipes the slate clean and then starts over and draws something completely different. It's really cool to see like the thought process he puts into color spreads or covers. And speaking of color spreads, we actually get to see a few of them get animated here in the opening towards the end of it. And in order, the 4 color spreads are as follows. So the first one, where they're jumping up excitedly looking at the glowing fireflies, is from chapter 609, and this one is gorgeous. It's definitely one of my favorites. The second one, where they're building a Lego house, is from chapter 622. The third one, where they're all being chased by that gang of killer sharks, is from chapter 612. And the fourth one and final one, where they're all floating above what looks to be London in giant teacups, is from chapter 676. And the one at the beginning, from my memory and research, is an original one created for this opening and has never appeared in the manga. If I'm wrong, let me know. But I did a pretty extensive search and I could not find this one. Finally, this opening does have spoilers like all the other openings, including some quick reveals of characters we have yet to meet, most notably the giant slime monster, the man in the sunglasses with the cracker stuck to his face, as well as the strange pink dragon standing with the kids in Kinemon. And then additionally, there's a random surprise shot of Doflamingo, which I think is probably the worst spoiler on here. Even without any context, this is still bad that they hint that he already has something to do with this arc, which is unfortunate, I feel like. Again, it's not like a huge spoiler in the grand scheme of things, but it is a nice surprise to see that Doflamingo is in this arc, but it just like completely sort of spoils it, I feel like. Of course, the most notable one that may or may not be a spoiler is just how much significance the meeting between Law and Luffy gets, but this one is given a lot of significance for good reason, as this moment is a cornerstone event for basically the rest of the series, more so than anyone could have ever imagined even at the time. I think this opening, though, overall is one of the less egregious ones when it comes to spoilers, as they don't really give anything away other than maybe Doflamingo's involvement, and maybe one of Luffy's new moves he ends up using later on in the arc, where he winds himself up and becomes like a rubber tornado, which I think is one of his cooler moves, to be honest, and this is like the only time he ever uses it. In any case, this episode became really long with a perfect storm of a lot of content in the episodes, a special crossover filler, as well as the start of a new opening. But if you stuck around for the whole thing, I thank you very much. And yeah, it'll be fun to see where this goes from here and how they get out of this situation with these seemingly powerful giant yetis on the loose now. And anyways, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and X account at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes, to see some pictures of my manga collection, as well as my One Piece card collection now. And yeah, no spoilers this time. There could be a few things I could talk about, but I think since this episode is already running pretty long, I will leave those out since they're not huge. But as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye!